From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew.
President Trump is set to address the captains of finance and tech at an investment conference run by Saudi Arabia's Sovereign Wealth Fund. We'll have a live report from Miami Beach with insights from Stephen A. Cook at the Council on Foreign Relations.
We'll bring you the president's remarks live as well. The latest on the DOGE, now turning its focus to the Pentagon. We'll discuss the impact with Congressman Seth Moulton, an Iraq War veteran, the House Armed Services Committee.
And we'll get his take on a standoff brewing on Capitol Hill, with the Senate starting debate on a budget resolution, even as President Trump states his preference for the House's version. Thanks for joining us on this Wednesday edition of Balance of Power. And we are waiting at this moment for President Trump to take the stage in Miami, where he is set to address the FII conference with any number of subjects potentially going to arise over the course of remarks that are scheduled to be a full hour long. He's
made his way to the venue, we understand. And joining us from the venue in Miami is Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall. They've carved out a good chunk of time, Tyler. What do we expect to hear from the president?
Yeah, hey, Joe, as you mentioned, we can confirm President Trump has arrived at this venue. Sources also tell Bloomberg News that Elon Musk, Jared Kushner, and Steve Witkoff are all in the room for these remarks tonight. And of course, this is the Future Investment Initiative Summit. So we are expecting President Trump to talk about this idea of increasing investment into the U.S. We know that the Saudi Crown Prince has promised President Trump that he will invest in upwards of $600 billion over the next 4 years into U.S. trade and investments. And while President Trump would like to see that number go higher, it's still attracted a whole slew of business leaders here to this conference who might be able to capitalize on this increased flow of monies between the two countries. According to the Bloomberg Billionaires Index, the expected net worth total of all the attendees here is upwards of $100 billion. There are some points that when it comes to similarities and agreement that we might see President Trump hit on, including increased investment in artificial intelligence and advanced manufacturing. But he could really go a number of different ways, particularly as Saudi Arabia comes to the center of many of the White House's policies recently. Just yesterday, of course, hosting those U.S.-Russia high-level talks. But Joe and Kelly, importantly, there are still many other points of contention, particularly when it comes to President Trump's plan for Gaza in the Middle East, which has been widely condemned by Arab leaders. So we'll have to see whether or not any of those points end up coming up as we expect these remarks to start shortly here in Miami.
Well, and then there's the question of tariffs, Tyler, because we know not all business leaders that may be gathered in that room are necessarily super receptive of the idea of those higher levies.
Right, exactly. And big news this week, of course, when it comes to tariffs. President Trump putting on the calendar that April 2nd date for potentially higher levies on up to 25% on autos, pharmaceuticals, and chips. That, of course, comes one day after that April 1st deadline for the USTR and Commerce to present their country-by-country findings when it comes to potential reciprocal tariffs. So a lot of things in the books here. Bloomberg Economics, of course, telling us that emerging economies could be hit the most, particularly when it comes to those reciprocal tariffs, and that Asian markets could be hit the most when it comes to those increased levies on autos, chips, and pharmaceuticals. So a lot of different business interests kind of aligning here tonight as we talk about the intersection of economic policy, but also President Trump's foreign policy as he's made tariffs such a centerpiece.
And Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall is covering all of it for us live in Miami. Thank you so much. And again, we are awaiting just any minute now remarks from President Trump. We have eyes on the podium. He has not yet walked up to it. We will bring those to you live here on Bloomberg TV and radio when they do begin. But as we await them, we turn now to Stephen A. Cook. He's Senior Fellow for Middle East and Africa Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, is also author of the book, The End of Ambition, America's Past, Present, and Future in the Middle East. Stephen, when we consider one relationship with a country in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia specifically, who, of course, is hosting this conference, what does Donald Trump want to get from the Saudis, and what do the Saudis hope to get in return from him?
Yeah, this really is a special relationship between the Trump administration and Saudi Arabia. Obviously, the president wants and appreciates the Crown Prince's commitment to spend upward of $600 billion investing in the United States. The president also, during his first term, very much wanted to sell American weaponry to Saudi Arabia, and that will continue. There's something else that's going on between the two countries. If you are the president of the United States and you enter the Oval Office and you take a look at the region, Saudi Arabia really is the last major Arab country that's still standing. Of course, there's Qatar and the UAE, but these are very, very small countries. Egypt has turned inward. Iraq remains unstable. Syria is a failed country. Saudi Arabia is the major Arab state that's a major partner of the United States. So it's natural for the president to gravitate towards the Saudis. The Saudis like the Trump administration because they believe they can get things done. They believe that President Trump runs the United States much like the Crown Prince runs Saudi Arabia, with 5 people on WhatsApp. There aren't endless meetings and interagency discussions about what to do about Saudi Arabia. The president understands what he wants to do, understands Saudi Arabia, and would like to move forward. So that's really where the connections are between this White House and the kingdom.
Well, there's one exception here when it comes to this relationship, Stephen, and that's President Trump's plans for Gaza, or at least what he has put forth as a plan for Gaza. Remembering he hosted Jordan's King Abdullah in the Oval Office just about a week ago. Let's remind our viewers and listeners about his plans to resettle Palestinians from the Gaza Strip.
I believe we'll have a parcel of land in Jordan. I believe we'll have a parcel of land in Egypt. We may have someplace else, but I think when we finish our talks, we'll have a place where they're going to live very happily and very safely.
Is there a parcel of land in Jordan that you're willing to have Palestinians?
Well, I think what we said, I have to look at the best interests of my country. I believe that the president is looking forward to getting a group of us Arabs here to discuss the overall plan.
Stephen, as we're considering the idea of deal-making with the Saudis, does this conversation about Gaza end in Miami?
It doesn't end in Miami. There is an Arab summit that is underway in Riyadh that includes the Emiratis, the Qataris, the Jordanians, and the Egyptians to discuss a counter proposal to what President Trump has suggested about moving about 2 million Palestinians out of the Gaza Strip and the United States owning it. All of the Arab leaders have flatly rejected that idea, but now the onus is on them to come back with a plan. And that seems to be what they are doing. Whether that satisfies Israelis or the Trump administration remains to be seen. I think the problem with the president's plan is that now the Israelis, particularly the Israeli right wing, has taken it and run with it and doesn't want to accept anything less than the transfer of Palestinians out of the Gaza Strip.
Well, and so until that plan can come together, can something else President Trump has signaled he wants to achieve come together, which is an expansion of the Abraham Accords?
No, I don't think so. I mean, it has been a surprise that the Abraham Accords have proved themselves to be so durable over these 16 months of terrible warfare in the Gaza Strip and elsewhere. But the Saudis have been pretty clear that now their price for normalization with Israel is a two-state solution. And somewhere in the neighborhood of 70% of Israelis reject the idea of a two-state solution after the October 7, 2023 attacks. So this is a very, very difficult issue. And it is something that the president has set his sights on. He sees himself as a master negotiator and deal maker. But the two sides are so far apart. It's hard to imagine the Israelis coming around to a two-state solution, and it's hard to imagine the Saudis coming around to anything less than a two-state solution after these 16 months of terrible warfare.
This is, of course, something that Steve Witkoff is helping the president work on, his Middle East envoy, who in fact showed up at the negotiating table to talk about a potential peace deal between Russia and Ukraine. Stephen, why is the president's Mideast envoy involved in European and Russian affairs?
I think it's because he's not just the president's Middle East envoy. A Washington parlor game has been, who is this version of the Trump administration's Jared Kushner? And that is Steve Witkoff. Steve Witkoff is the president's golf partner. They've known each other for many years. They're loyal to each other. And I think that Mr. Witkoff's portfolio is much broader than the Israel-Hamas ceasefire, negotiations with the Iranians and the Middle East more generally, and is going to be sort of a foreign policy advisor and troubleshooter. And it strikes me that's why he was in the room in Riyadh when American officials were meeting with Russian officials.
Well, and when we think about what the end game is with those talks that have begun, Stephen, it's obviously trying to reach a peace deal in Ukraine that critics of this administration are suggesting the president is signaling it is going to be more favorable toward Russia. If that is what we end up with, if Russia is able to get at least some of what it wants in Ukraine in terms of territory, what signal could that send to others, thinking about the relationship between, say, Russia and Iran specifically?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think that, what the enthusiasm for President Trump in the Middle East masks very significant anxiety about him. And that is that he has been willing to negotiate with the Iranians, just as he's demonstrated he's willing to negotiate with the Russians. And I think that the Arab leaders are looking at what's happening with Ukraine and saying to themselves, well, if he can dump the Ukrainians, what will he do to us? Will he sell us out? And in fact, the Arab hedging with other global powers, specifically the Chinese, accelerated during the first Trump administration because despite the fact that they liked Trump, there were aspects of his policies in the Middle East that they were quite fearful of, specifically his willingness to withdraw American forces from the region. His desire to actually strike a deal with the Iranians rather than confront Iran's malevolent activities around the region. So, like I said, as much as there is enthusiasm for Trump, there's a certain wariness about this, and the Ukraine situation is just deepening that wariness for Arab leaders.
Stephen, thanks for being with us. Stephen A. Cook, a senior fellow for Middle East Africa Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. Many thanks for your insights. Coming up, the DOGE says it's saved $55 billion already in federal spending. The receipts show much less. We'll have details next on Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg TV and Radio.
One of the biggest functions of the DOGE team is just making sure that the presidential executive orders are actually carried out. And this is, I just want to point out, this is a very important thing because the president is the elected representative of the people. So he's representing the will of the people. And if the bureaucracy is fighting the will of the people and preventing the president from implementing what the people want, then what we live in is a bureaucracy and not a democracy.
Elon Musk in a joint interview with President Trump. How about the optics on Fox sitting side by side, talking about the role of the DOGE in the administration? Now, in addition to enacting Donald Trump's agenda, the DOGE says it's been busy, saving $55 billion in federal spending so far. But its website only accounts for about $8.5 billion. Joining us now with some difficult math, Bloomberg's Laura Davison, who runs our political coverage here in Washington. The wall of receipts they've posted on the website, Laura, doesn't seem to add up to what we're talking about here.
It doesn't. So the top line number that they gave is that $55 billion has been saved. Trump has even said that there's been hundreds of billions. But when you actually go through and add up all of the canceled contracts that they have listed out, it only comes to about $8.6 billion. It's even not clear if that's sort of kind of on the high end range because some of these contracts have sort of at a ceiling level. So this, sort of really raises a lot of questions about both the accountability and the reliability of the data that DOGE is putting out there about the work they're doing. They don't have the same kind of watchdogs that other federal agencies have, and there's been a lot of criticism from Democrats for that.
Well, it also, to me, raises the question of whether the targets they've set out are actually achievable. We've already seen, obviously, deep cuts in many areas of the federal government have begun. If we're only in the not even $10 billion. How are we ever going to get to $1 trillion plus?
Most people who are familiar with the federal budget agree that $1 trillion, reduction in the deficit is almost impossible with the kinds of cuts that they're looking at. You would really need Congress to do something, and that would mean deep cuts to Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, things that are really those third rail of politics that are very, very difficult to do. At one point, Musk was even talking about $2 trillion worth of cuts. That is more than all of the discretionary spending. So basically everything that funds all the federal agencies, you could cut all of that and still not get to $2 trillion.
Which brings us to the back and forth over Social Security and Medicare, which Donald Trump now says he doesn't want to touch. But he also just endorsed a bill in the House of Representatives, one big, beautiful bill, Laura. As we're told, even as the Senate comes up with its own plan, it doesn't deal with this particular issue. So he's sided with the House version, even though it does take money away from some of these entitlements. What's the latest on this reconciliation plan? Who's going to make it to the finish line?
It's still unclear. Both the House and Senate, they saw the tweet from the president this morning, endorsing the House strategy here. Yeah. And both sides said full steam ahead, which both Republicans in both chambers were wanting some clarity from the president, having him put the finger on the scale. But what they really wanted that was a month or two ago. They both have started their own legislative procedures here. The likelihood and sort of the wind is behind the back of the House, both because they have Trump's blessing here, but also it's always good to bet the under on Congress doing more bills, more complicated, fewer bills, less complicated.
Well, we did hear from the Senate Majority Leader, John Thune, who at first signaled a bit of surprise about the president coming out and saying this, but had this to say about what it means for the path forward.
If the House can produce one big, beautiful bill, we're prepared to work with them to get that across the finish line. But we believe that the president also likes optionality. The question right now, again, is a tactical one. The strategic objective is still the same, and that is to extend the tax policy, strengthen the economy, rebuild the military, create energy dominance for this country, and secure our border.
So John Thune kind of raising a notion that I'm sure plenty of our audience here on Bloomberg TV and radio might agree with, which is, does it matter how it gets done as much as that these things do get done eventually somehow?
That is generally where Republicans are. The problem is for the Senate strategies, what House Republicans will say is they're doing the thing that doesn't have a deadline, a hard deadline first. They're looking at immigration policies. There's nothing that happens if, that gets pushed into 2026. The taxes, however, those will expire at the end of the year, and people will immediately see tax increases come 2026. So that's where you see Republicans, particularly in the House, getting nervous, saying, look, if we don't meet this deadline, if we're not able to agree and, getting anything through the House. You've got, your SALT state Republicans from New York and California that want SALT. You have your very wily and squirrely Freedom Caucus members. Doing anything is going to be difficult, and they just sort of have acknowledged that any goodwill that they have, and that's already very thin, they just really have one shot to get something done.
All right, Bloomberg's Laura Davison, thank you so much. And coming up, President Trump is set to address the Future Investment Initiative Summit in Miami at this hour. We're awaiting him at the podium, which you see live here on Bloomberg TV and on YouTube. We'll have a look at what we can expect from his remarks with our political panel next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV, YouTube, and radio. Welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Kaylee Lyons alongside Joe Matthew, and we are awaiting at this hour remarks from President Trump speaking at the Future Investment Initiative Summit in Miami, sponsored, of course, by Saudi Arabia's sovereign wealth fund, with many business leaders and geopolitical figures in the audience, including some well-known in this administration. Elon Musk is there, as well as the Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff.
That's a live view of the crowd in Miami waiting for President Trump, who arrived at the venue some time ago. Can only imagine the conversations, Kaylee, that might be happening backstage at this event sponsored by Saudi Arabia's sovereign wealth fund, and knowing that there are great hopes in this administration to unlock an economic partnership. We don't have a great sense of what Donald Trump's going to be talking about, though, do we? They just carved out a lot of time for him, and the podium is ready.
Yeah, it certainly is. And of course, we'll bring those remarks to you live here on Bloomberg TV and radio when they begin, as we see Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law, in the audience as well. And joining us is our political panel this evening as we await these remarks. Lester Munson is with us, co-head of the international practice at BGR Group and Republican strategist, alongside Caitlin Legacki, Democratic strategist and former Commerce Department official under the Biden administration. Lester, just to begin with you, as we really do not know what President Trump is going to come out and say. Certainly he could talk about foreign direct investment into the United States, how he would like to see more of it. But given what has dominated the news in the last 24 hours plus, his rhetoric around Ukraine, what else geopolitically could we hear from him when he begins speaking?
Well, we could hear more from him on the situation in the Middle East. Of course, his Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, is still in the region having conversations about the future of Gaza and the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. We could hear more about what he's thinking about China. Is he going to go see Xi Jinping in the next few months? How is he imagining the tariffs that he's discussed are going to play out in terms of the bilateral relationship? How does all of this fit together? Is there a kind of a global vision that President Trump has that he could share with us that kind of guide us through the steps he's taken on the Ukraine negotiations in particular, where it really seems like we're tilting way in favor of Russia, which is, I think, counterintuitive to almost all Americans. So there's a whole range of issues he could be discussing. He could also get out there and start talking about golf. So we're going to learn a lot.
Well, that's not a joke. The idea of a PGA Live Golf merger being announced at this event is something that's actually been reported. We know, Caitlin, talks have been underway. Is this the type of deliverable that President Trump is hoping for?
I mean, I think it is something that he personally would like to deliver, but I think the American people are much more focused on issues like whether or not he's going to cut Social Security and Medicaid. But I do think it drives the point that President Trump has been seemingly focused on issues as frivolous as this golf merger, while Elon Musk seems to be doing a lot of the decision making about how this government is going to operate. And I think, you know, you're starting to see his poll numbers decline. You're starting to see him come back down to earth. And I think there's a real question about how much patience American voters have for this kind of split attention.
Well, when we consider what is grabbing at least a lot of our attention in Washington today, which is the Truth Social post from the president earlier today regarding Ukraine and specifically Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who he referred to as a moderately successful comedian before then referring to him as a dictator. Those comments on Truth Social following what the president had to say verbally while signing executive orders yesterday about elections in Ukraine. Let's remind ourselves of his words.
We have a situation where we haven't had elections in Ukraine, where we have martial law, essentially martial law in Ukraine, where the leader in Ukraine, I mean, I hate to say it, but he's down at 4% approval rating, and where a country has been blown to smithereens. Yeah, I would say that, you know, when they want a seat at the table, you could say the people have to, wouldn't the people of Ukraine have to say, like, you know, it's been a long time since we've had an election. That's not a Russia thing. That's something coming from me and coming from many other countries also.
So, Lester, first of all, the 4% approval rating does seem to be factually inaccurate based on the latest polls. Obviously, when we consider martial law and the lack of elections held in Ukraine, this is a country that has been at war for years now. If he is to reuse some of this language, including the idea that Zelensky is a dictator in this room tonight, how is that likely to be received by those gathered?
Well, yeah, I don't know who's. I mean, we saw some of the people in the audience. They may cheer no matter what he says. I think, and I'm all for kind of shaking up negotiations and being creative and getting outside the usual patterns that may have been ossified, that weren't going to lead to much of a solution. But this really does strike me as kind of odd that we would characterize President Zelensky in this way. This is a very courageous man who has led his people in an almost unimaginable fight against a horrible enemy that invaded them really without provocation 3 years ago. It's simply very strange to me to characterize him in that way. If this is somehow advancing a solution that is fair to everyone on the ground, okay, fine. I'm not really sure what the path is, though, to something that Zelensky will agree to, that Europe is going to be willing to maybe make some sacrifices to back up, that we'd be willing to make some sacrifices to back up. This seems like it's gone a little too far to me. So I'm not really sure what the point of all that was. I don't think that message is being well received by most Republicans in Congress. There's probably a few who think it's just fine, but I think most of the mainstream Republican allies of the president on the Hill are a little concerned right now.
Caitlin, President Trump said the only thing he was good at, referring to Zelensky, was playing Biden like a fiddle. Went on to refer to him as a dictator without elections. And he also said Zelensky better move fast or he's not going to have a country left, knowing that he doesn't have a seat at the table. I'm not sure how fast he can go here, Caitlin, but what's your thought on turning these negotiations in Russia's favor with rhetoric like this?
I mean, it's alarming. I would also say that it was completely alarming that he tweeted today about himself, "Long live the king." We're seeing a huge escalation in his rhetoric online, especially, but we're also seeing it in press conferences. And I think, if there are Republicans who are alarmed about this kind of rhetoric on the Hill, like, now is the time that they have to start doing something about it, because there's been a significant expansion of executive power in this administration. And that's going to be hard to claw back if they let him go further than they're comfortable with. So I think now is the time for people like Tom Tillis, Lisa Murkowski, and Susan Collins to act. And they really have to reestablish themselves as a co-equal branch.
Well, but what does that actually look like, if them acting congressionally, Caitlin? Is that trying to appropriate more funding for Ukraine? That obviously there is some dispute about whether this administration is actually acting on the appropriations that Congress has laid out and making sure that money gets spent. What realistically is the check?
There's a couple different things. One, Congress can sue. If the executive branch is not spending the money that has been congressionally appropriated, there is a venue for Congress to sue the executive branch. There's also the Republicans hold both the House and the Senate. If, for example, Susan Collins wanted to hold up any sort of votes on nominees or on the budget until they get assurances from the president and Elon Musk about actually spending appropriated funds, they could do that. They just, I think, are, in a place where they need to figure out what exactly their plan of action is and then execute against that.
If you're with us on Bloomberg TV or YouTube, you see the video here starting on the screen behind the stage as we stand by for a speech from President Trump. He's going to be speaking shortly here at the Financial Summit, the Foreign Investment Summit that's underway right now in Miami Beach. This is going to be not only his final word here, Lester, he's also going to be back on Fox News this evening. We already showed you a bit of this, a side-by-side interview that he did with Elon Musk, almost as if it was his vice president. What do you make of the optics here as Donald Trump addresses the nation with Elon Musk almost as an equal in his conversation here with Sean Hannity?
Joe, I find this whole thing fascinating. There's been a kind of a tradition in American politics, I think, and this may be more true with Republican presidents than Democratic presidents, where there seems to be someone who emerges as kind of the bad guy. I remember during the Reagan administration, James Watt was kind of singled out as this guy who was doing terrible things. And gosh, if only President Reagan would reel him in. This is part of how the government works. The president gets to appoint who he wants. The Senate has a role in confirming some of them, of course, but the president is in charge of staffing the executive branch. And so this is his decision. And I think he's happy to let Musk go out there and to some extent be the bad guy and the person that everyone's throwing complaints to, while he sits there and talks about ending congestion pricing in New York and doing all of these wonderful things that are fairly popular. He can let Elon Musk go be the bad guy, and then he can be the good guy at the top. It's kind of, yes, no, it's good cop, bad cop. This is not a bad dichotomy for Trump's sake. And if things go badly, he can always tell Musk, you're done.
What's your thought on that, Caitlin, to see a president who's so concerned with his own authority to be sharing a stage, essentially, with Elon Musk in that interview? Was something I'm assuming J.D. Vance was watching on TV as well.
I think no one is happier to let Elon Musk be the heat shield than J.D. Vance. It's clear that, over the course of his prior presidency, President Trump had a hard time sharing the spotlight with anyone who came close to outshining him. The question is whether he can maintain, or whether Elon can maintain a relationship with him while doing that, or if, to Lester's point, this is a short-term situation where Trump allows Elon to cut all of this spending, that many of which is significantly popular. And then he gets to say that Elon went too far, I'm firing this guy. and he gets the best of both worlds. I don't know. I think that Trump is definitely playing a little bit of a dangerous game here. It's certainly a game he hasn't played before, but he seems to be leveraging Elon and his platform for all that it's worth.
Well, we are expecting that President Trump will be walking up to the podium in Miami in just a moment. He's currently being introduced by Richard Attias, the FII Institute CEO, who has just introduced him. Now we see on Bloomberg TV and on YouTube, the President of the United States is entering the room, again, set to speak for what was slotted to be an hour, although it does look like, Joe, this will begin about half an hour late. So we'll see if he indeed runs until 6:30 Eastern time or things get cut a bit short.
Yeah, he's been in Florida, of course, was at Mar-a-Lago and held a news conference there live yesterday. We're doing the Lee Greenwood thing. That could take us a couple of minutes here if they're playing out the president here. This is something that we're used to seeing at the rallies and, of course, now a lot of events. We start with Lee Greenwood. So let's keep the panel with us for a moment here as they do the musical interlude in Miami and kind of extend, Lester, on our conversation about Elon Musk. He's not the only one on the front row there. We saw Jared Kushner, of course, his son-in-law, deep ties to Saudi Arabia. We saw his Mideast envoy, Steve Witkoff, who just returned from Saudi Arabia, as a matter of fact. To what extent will they play into any deal-making happening at this event?
Well, Witkoff seems to have the hot hand. He was involved in the ceasefire in Gaza even before Trump was sworn in as president. He was at the table, I think, with Secretary Rubio yesterday in Saudi talking about Ukraine. So Witkoff seems to be an increasingly important player inside Trump world, and so I think that's a pretty significant thing. I'd keep my eye on him as much as I'd keep my eye on Musk. It really seems like the president is, and it's almost like a basketball game. Who's hitting their shots? Who's on a streak? Let's get that person the ball and just see how long they can do this.
Wow.
Well, Steve Witkoff was just described to us earlier on this program by Stephen A. Cook of the Council on Foreign Relations as the real national security advisor. Caitlin, where are Mike Waltz, the actual named national security advisor, for that matter, Keith Kellogg, who's supposed to be the envoy for Ukraine specifically in all of this?
I think Trump likes having a number of different people working on similar portfolios so that he can play them against each other and push them, encourage them to compete. So I think everyone at some point is involved, but he picks his favorites.
What a great group this is.
All right, Caitlin, Lester, thank you for the insights. We're going to listen to President Trump now. Again, he's at the podium live in Miami on Bloomberg TV.